Why do our best ideas so often arrive only after we stop forcing them? Why does sleep sometimes unlock a solution that felt impossible the night before? What exactly happens in the brain just before an aha moment appears? Can anxiety and fixation block insight? And in a world of instant answer and generative AI, are we expanding creativity or making it easier to get stuck on the first polished solutions? So for that and more, we have our guest today, John Kounios, PhD professor of psychology in Drexel University's doctoral program in applied cognitive and brain sciences, and one of the leading researchers on creativity, insight, and the science of the aha moment. His research on problem-solving, memory, creativity, and brain aging, along with his best-selling book, The Eureka Factor, co-authored with Mark Beeman, has helped shape the way we understand creative breakthroughs and the brain mechanisms behind them. Enjoy the episode. Hi, John. Thank you for being interviewed today. Thank you for willing to come here and to answer all the questions in the podcast about AI and creativity. It's really nice.
Good to be with you. Happy to do it.
Thank you. So my first question always is related to more something personal. What drew you personally to the study of insight and creativity? I would like to know if there was a specific moment that you realized that this was something or a question that you would like to devote yourself to.
Yes, there was a specific moment. It was around, I don't know if it was 1999 or 2000, but at that point in my career, I was mostly doing research on the cognitive neuroscience of memory. And memory, the study of memory is, shall we say, it's a mature area of cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. People have been studying it for a long time. A lot of the basic parameters are well understood. There's still a lot more to learn, obviously. But I was interested in branching out into some area where I could sort of get in on the ground floor and be more of a pioneer. So I gave it some thought. I remember I was sitting at a computer terminal. I don't think we have those anymore, but it was a computer terminal at the University of Pennsylvania. And I thought about this, and it came up. What came to mind was to study the cognitive neuroscience of creativity. And that, there were a couple of reasons why I thought of that. One is I had done a couple of studies on insight, the aha phenomenon, already. So I had some foundation in that. Creativity has a solid history of research in psychology going back to around 1950. But by the year 2000 or so, there had been almost no research on the neuroscience of creativity, almost nothing. And at that time, brain imaging techniques were starting to become sophisticated enough to enable us to study more complex phenomena. So I thought to myself, well, this is a really interesting area. It's a very important area. Creativity is very important to not only scientifically, but in terms of the business world, education, the arts, all of these things. It's interesting to people personally. So we have a basis of research in the psychology. We have the importance, the interest, the fact that almost nothing had been done in the terms of the brain mechanism of creativity. So I thought this would be a great area to branch out into, and it's been my main focus ever since. So it was both for theoretical and practical and personal reasons as well.
In other words, you kind of wanted to be creative with your field of study or innovate.
I wanted to be creative with it. I wanted to be able to be a pioneer in a particular area that people would find important and interesting.
So for many people, creativity, when you talk about creativity, they think about art. So what is the connection between creativity of a eureka moment, which is what mostly you studied, and how would you describe what an insight moment is and parallel to a creative moment of art, for example?
Okay, so creativity is not restricted to art. Certainly in creativity and eureka moments are involved in creating art, but they're also involved in everything. I mean, anytime you come up with some novel solution to a problem or think of a novel problem. Even sort of problem finding is an understudied area of creativity as well. So it requires creativity in art, in science, in business. Entrepreneurs tend to be very creative people who imagine new areas of an economy, new technologies, things like that. We use creativity. We have insights in our daily lives. I mean, it could be something as simple as figuring out how to get a toddler to eat vegetables. Might require some creative insight, some eureka moment to figure that out.
Use it a
So there
lot.
are, yeah, I mean, so there are sort of these little aha moments where we solve daily problems with some creative leap. And often we forget those. They don't stick in the mind. It's just sort of part of the daily grind of life. And then there are these big eureka moments that solve problems in science or new ideas in philosophy or religion. Eureka moments occur in all areas of life, little ones, big ones, powerful ones, ones that are, just more personal. But we should mention what we mean by a eureka moment or aha moment.
Yeah. Okay.
So at least in the United States, it's gone into the popular culture, and the understanding or the definition of what it means in popular culture is a little bit different from what it means in scientific research. So in the popular culture, it's sort of like any deep understanding of something would be considered an aha moment or a eureka moment. In psychological science and in cognitive neuroscience, where it's more specific, it's a new idea or understanding or new perspective that pops into the mind suddenly. So, for example, if you add up a column of numbers and you get to the solution, and that's not an aha moment, because you're using a method that you learned in school. You add the numbers up and you get to a solution, but it doesn't pop into awareness. You can see the progress towards the solution. An aha moment would be something where maybe you're taking a shower or walking the dog or something like that, and all of a sudden you have this idea. It could be an idea that solves a problem that you've been dealing with or that other people have been dealing with, or it could even be a problem that you didn't know you had. So, for example, there's a professor at the Sloan School of Business at MIT named Eric von Hippel, and he's done a lot of research in business and economics on what he calls need-solution pairs. And what that is when a person has an idea that is both the problem and the solution at the same time. So, for example, you might look at, I'll give you a concrete example. So, in 1943, at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyards, there was an engineer, a Navy engineer named Richard James. And his job at the time was to install springs as shock absorbers on instruments in the ship, so that if the ship was buffeted around in turbulent seas, the instruments would be stabilized so people could read the gauges. And one of these springs escaped from his hand and started bouncing around the ship like it had a life of its own. Now, in that moment, he had this amazing realization popped into his head, and that is, wow, this spring could make a great basis for a toy. And he refined it, and it became a toy, which in the United States is called the Slinky. And it's this spring that you can do things with, and you can make it go down the stairs, go up the stairs. You can do tricks with it. And the Slinkies were huge when I was a kid. They're still around. People still play with them, but they're not electronic, so people don't play with them as much as they used to. So in that moment, he was not trying to think of, what kind of toy can I invent? He saw the spring bouncing around, and at the same moment, he thought of both the problem and the solution. The problem being, what kind of toy can I invent? And the solution being, here it is. So these eureka moments.
Is this the same mechanism as finding a solution for a problem and the same one that you just described? Is this the same mechanism in the brain?
Well, see, here's the problem. It's very difficult to study that in a laboratory. Probably yes, but it's harder to generate in a laboratory for study these need solution pairs than it is to just give people puzzles or problems and see if they have an aha moment. So we don't know much about whether they're different or not. There's no reason to think that they're different, or at least no reason to think that they're different from any other spontaneous sort of aha moment, like you're in the shower and you just think of a solution to a problem that you've been thinking about off and on for years, for example. So it's probably the same. We don't know for sure. We don't know for sure. So those kinds of eureka moments occur in, all aspects of life, not just art. Sorry, go ahead. You were going to say something.
No, I was just going to say we will dive more into it.
Okay.
About the kind of things. I have mentioned it to the listeners, but I have read your book twice. I just loved reading it. And each time I have a new insight. And one of the many things that I've noticed is I really liked the fact when you were talking about, you and your co-author were talking about how the brain blinks just before an aha moment appears. Can you just talk about it for a second? What happens just before you have this, moment of insight?
So in our brain imaging studies, going back to our first brain imaging study, which was published in 2004, we gave people these little verbal puzzles. They're called compound remote associates. So each one consists of 3 words. For example, pine, crab, and sauce would be one example. And you have to think of a 4th word that forms a compound or familiar phrase with each of those words. In this case, the solution is apple, pineapple, crab apple, applesauce. Now, we use those kinds of puzzles along with other kinds of puzzles in our studies because they have a couple of features that make them amenable to brain imaging. Is that when people can solve them, and people don't always solve all of them, but they solve a fair number of them, they can solve them fairly quickly, usually within 5 to 10, 15 seconds, something like that. So we can get a lot of examples of these solutions from people so that we can do real brain imaging. Another benefit of these kinds of puzzles is that when people solve them, and there's 2 basic ways they can solve them. One would be what we call analytically, that is in a conscious, deliberate way. So for example, if I have the puzzle pine, crab, sauce, a person might try to analytically solve it by thinking pine. What goes with pine? Well, tree goes with pine, pine tree. Does tree go with sauce? No. All right. It's not going to be tree. What else goes with pine? Cone, pine cone. Does cone go with tree? Well, sort of. Does it go with sauce? No. So working through it deliberately, or they might have the solution just because the word apple just pops into their consciousness as an aha moment, a eureka moment. So people solve some of these puzzles analytically and some of them with aha moments or insight, as psychological scientists call it. And we can compare the brain activity for these 2 types of solutions. So the type of puzzle stays the same, but the way that people solve it differs from person to person and from puzzle to puzzle. So we can compare the 2 types of brain activity and see what's different about them. And one of the things that the main finding we had from the initial study was that for these types of puzzles, the aha moment involves a burst of high-frequency brain waves in a part of the right temporal lobe just above the right ear called the right anterior superior temporal gyrus. And that showed that these aha moments, that was just at the moment that the solution pops into awareness. That shows that solving a problem by insight is different from solving a problem in this conscious, deliberate, analytical fashion. But one of the things that surprised us is that about a fraction of a second before that burst of activity that corresponds to the aha moment, there was a suppression of brain activity in the part of the brain that processes incoming visual information from the eyes, visual cortex, back of the brain. What we know from this type of suppression of brain activity in visual cortex, going back to the earliest studies of the electroencephalogram or EEG back in the 90s, is that these kinds of brain waves called alpha waves in visual cortex reflect a suppression of visual information coming in. So we call this a brain blink in our research. What seems to be the case is that the solution to the puzzle pre-exists in the brain. Your brain has found the solution, but it hasn't popped up into awareness. It hasn't crossed that threshold into awareness yet. So the brain, at some level, senses that the solution exists, but can't quite grab hold of it. So for a moment, blocks incoming visual information that would distract a person. So for example, this kind of distraction occurs all the time. If you look someone right in the face and you ask them a really difficult question, what they'll often do is they'll look away, or they'll close their eyes, or they'll look up or down at their shoes, because faces are very distracting. So, and you need to block out some of that distracting incoming visual information to reduce to increase, shall we say, the signal to noise ratio, to make that solution that is weakly activated in memory. You want to get rid of some of the noise, the incoming noise, so that can bubble up into awareness. So the brain, one way to do that is, if you're trying to come up with an idea, go off to a quiet place where there are no distractions. The brain also will do that for you sometimes, and it will just cut off a little bit of your awareness of the environment so that these ideas can bubble up. So that's what I mean by brain blink.
Sorry, no, I was just going to ask you about that. Is that why we often have these aha moments or creative moments in the shower or while meditating? I know there are other reasons for it, and you will probably talk about it in a few minutes. But just now, I just thought about you have another research about ADHD and solving problems creatively with aha moments. And we know, according to your research, that ADHDers solve more problems with creative insights. But on the other hand, now when I think about it, when you're talking about distraction, so I'm thinking about, on the other hand, ADHD people with severe symptoms, they usually find it really hard to concentrate. It's really hard for them to just, meditate, or even specifically close or blink, as you said it, to block out these distractions. So how does it coexist together?
Okay, that's a really good question. So in terms of this blocking out the environment, sorry. So that was actually 2 or 3 questions there. So let me pull that apart.
Sorry.
So yes, in the shower, people tend to have these aha moments for more than one reason. I'll just mention the one reason is sort of sensory restriction. So in the shower, there's white noise. You don't see very much because the water is in your eyes or your eyes are closed. And even if your eyes are open, things are blurry. The water's warm, so you don't feel the difference between sort of the inside of the body and the outside. You don't feel the boundary of the skin, of your skin and the air, the way you do as much when you're not in the shower. So there's less incoming sensory information to distract one. So that's just, and we could talk about some of the other reasons why showers are great for that. In fact, the screenwriter Aaron Sorkin, who's written famous movies and TV shows like The Social Network, he said in an interview, I think maybe even more than one interview, when he's working on a script, he takes 6 to 8 showers a day just to get ideas for his writing. So some people have, turned this into a technique. Okay, so now in terms of insights and distractions, what I had worded it carefully. So distractions, when you eliminate distractions or reduce them, this can promote certain types of insights. So for these types of puzzles, where the solution is there in the head somewhere and has to bubble up. But there are other types of insights. So for example, Richard James' insight about the spring and making into a toy, if he had not been paying attention to his environment, he would not have had that idea. So other types of insights are triggered by stimulating the environment. If you block out the environment, you're not going to have those insights. You could be walking down the street and looking at things, and you could be I'm saying, oh, there's a street sign, there's a store, there are shoes in that store window, that person's wearing a funny hat, the weather's nice today. A person who has ADHD, for example, might just be looking at all of these things and get distracted, but the sight of one of those things could trigger an insight. Whereas a person who's very focused and has no ADHD, they're walking down the street and they're not looking at all these things. They're thinking, I'm going to the doctor's office. I'm going to walk 2 blocks down and turn right, and there's the doctor. They're not being distracted by all these things. So distractions can be helpful for certain types of insights because those stimuli in the environment can trigger ideas. But if you're working on an existing problem and the solution may be already somewhere there, the distractions can actually interfere with finding what's already there, as opposed to finding what's out there.
Wow, fascinating. I never thought about it this way. Like this is the difference between the two types. I mean, everyone knows, I think it's related to the other type of solving a problem, but everyone knows the saying that when you can't find a solution, just slip on it.
Yes.
And I want to ask you why specifically it's related to the previous question. Why does sleep sometimes help us solve a problem? And you talked a little bit about this threshold that we have the solution and we're kind of, we need to make it to the conscious. Can you explain a little bit about what we know in the research about it?
Mm-hmm. Well, sleep helps. Sleep might be the most powerful way to enhance creativity. There are many famous examples from history of people who have these fantastic ideas come into their awareness, either waking them up in the middle of the night, or they wake up in the morning and they're not fully awake and the idea just sort of comes to them, or they work on a problem during the day, they go to sleep, and then the next day they have the solution, probably as a result of having slept on it. So sleep has multiple effects on creativity. One effect that we haven't talked about yet is mood. So a positive mood enhances creativity. It makes insights more likely. Whereas anxiety, that kind of negative mood, makes analytical thinking more likely. And sleep puts you in a good mood. I mean, no one is in a good mood when they haven't gotten enough sleep. Everyone is in a better mood once they've slept. So that's one aspect. That's one aspect right there of how sleep helps. Sleep also enables you to do, there's a process that cognitive psychologists call fixation forgetting, or sometimes forgetting fixation. The different researchers flip the words. So often we can't solve a problem because we're stuck on the wrong idea of how to do it. And we can't get that idea out of our heads. And when you're working on a problem and you're stuck, it helps to take a break from that and to do other things, because that will enable you to, that will weaken the grip of the wrong idea on you. That wrong idea will fade into the background when you take a break and you do something else. But during sleep supercharges that process so that it really helps to flush out the bad ideas that you're stuck on, and which enables new ideas to come to you. Sleep seems to have another benefit too, and that is there's a process called memory consolidation. So during the day, you acquire information from the environment. At night, your brain reprocesses that information to store it in a more durable, more easier to retrieve format in memory. And that memory consolidation, so memory consolidation, you could think of it sort of like cement. When you pour it, it's wet, and it's soft, and you could put a handprint in it or footprint in it. Once it dries and hardens, it's very, very strong. Memories are like that. You acquire memory during the day. It's sort of soft and malleable. It can be, it's not that well established. While you sleep, it becomes consolidated, it dries, it hardens, it becomes more durable. There's an exception to that. We now know that when you retrieve a memory, that cement gets soft again, and it can be rehardened in a little bit different format, in which case you can get false memories. But that's a digression. So in when memories are consolidated, they're not just dried and hardened, they're reprocessed, sometimes to bring out details and hidden relationships that are in the memories. So when you sleep and the information you've taken in is reprocessed by the brain, that can bring out new associations and things, which can then help you to solve a problem. So sleep is, anytime you're stuck on a problem and sleep and you think like, I don't know what I'm going to do, how I'm going to move forward, this is not working, just relax. Even if you take a nap, even just take a half-hour nap, that can sometimes do the trick. You wake up and then everything looks fresh and simpler and easier to deal with. But part of the problem, we were talking about stress earlier, is that stress messes up sleep. You get less sleep, it's lower quality sleep, and then it makes it harder and harder to be creative and to think flexibly, because, as I said, sleep is a fantastic way to open the mind, make it flexible, creative, and insightful.
It's all connected, I guess. And I would like to ask if there is a way for us to hack this, let's say, the brain processes that occur while sleeping, in cases when, just hypothetically, in cases that you can not get enough sleep. Many people, live very stressful life, and they just can't, or
especially these days.
Yeah, especially these days. Smiling.
Yeah.
Some of the listeners obviously are.
Yes.
They know this feeling, and we still want to get that, innovative breakthroughs. We still want to get these aha moments, or just get creative, good mood, everything. So is there a way, like, I don't know, meditation or anything like it that maybe you studied or your colleagues studied, that kind of gets you to the hack to the creative moment?
Yes. All right. So creativity, insight, the hack is not like a button you can push and have ideas. It doesn't work that way. These eureka moments, they're sort of like cats. You can't order a cat around, but you can coax the cat and make it more likely that the cat will come to you and cooperate. So now, as I said, sleep is sort of, possibly the ultimate way to enhance creativity. But if you can't get enough sleep or can't get more sleep, you can do other things. So, for example, as I mentioned, being in a positive mood is a very powerful way to increase creativity. We find in our research, other people have found that when you're in a positive mood, you're more likely to solve problems with these sudden insights, and you're actually less likely to solve them in an analytical fashion. So to explain this, let me give sort of describe a scenario. Let's say you're an early human on the savannah in Africa, and way off in the distance, you see a lion. So what happens? Right then and there, you become anxious, and you start thinking in a very deliberate, analytical fashion. How far away is that lion? Can the lion see me? Can the lion hear me? Am I upwind or downwind of the lion? If I run, can that lion catch me? Is there a place for me to hide? You start thinking very analytically about this. And you think analytically about it because you cannot afford to make a mistake. If you make a mistake, you become the lion's lunch. So let's say, and that anxiety, it narrows the focus of attention. It makes you very analytical. Now, let's say you get away from the lion and you're back with your clan. You're in a nice cave that night. The cave is safe. There's a fire. It's warm. There's a rack of antelope cooking on the fire. There's plenty of food. You're around your friends and loved ones in your clan, and everyone is relaxed. Now, under those circumstances, the sense of threat is low. And because you're not anxious and because you're relaxed and you're in a good mood, you can afford to take, shall we say, intellectual risks. You can think crazy thoughts. You can think silly thoughts. If you say something stupid, it doesn't matter because you're not going to get eaten because of it. So under those circumstances, the mind expands, the positive mood, the mind expands there's less of a filter between sort of the brain and the mouth, or within the brain. Remote associations, crazy ideas are allowed into awareness as a function of being in a positive mood, because positive mood means low sense of threat. So anything you do that improves your mood will make you more creative. If, go hang out with friends that you love and just have a good time. Go to a museum, look at beautiful art, take a little vacation, just go take a walk in a park. Do anything that will make you happy, put you in a positive mood. Also, another thing that helps is that all of these things are connected, as we said. So positive mood is also connected to attention. So if you're in a small cramped space like an office cubicle, your perceptual attention cannot expand to fill a big space. But if you're in a large room with high ceilings, or even better, you go outside, your attention can expand to fill that large space. And that perceptual attention is linked with what we call conceptual attention. So when your perceptual attention expands to fill a large space, so does your mind open up to ideas. The scope of thought is expanded, and to encompass ideas that otherwise would have been shut out. So the blinders are taken off and your mind opens up. Go into a big space. Go outside, take a walk. Go to any large room with high ceilings, and anything like that will open up the mind to have more thoughts. Another thing that it may surprise people is the time of day. So some people, they're different, what are called chronotypes. Some people are morning people, and they tend to be at their sharpest and most alert in the morning. Those are the morning doves, you might say. And then there are night owls, people who are at their sharpest and most alert at night. When you're at your peak time of day, whether it's morning or evening, that's when you do your best analytical work. But you do your best creative work at your off-peak time of day. So if you're a morning person, put time aside to generate creative ideas at night. If you're a night person, do it in the morning, because when you're at your off-peak time of day, your attention is fuzzier, your thinking is a little fuzzier, and what that also means is more expansive. You're more likely to be a little disinhibited and to have ideas that you wouldn't have when you were in a more alert, focused state. So that's another way to do it. You can also do this sort of artificially. I mean, I don't recommend that anybody drink alcohol, but if you're going to have, a little bit of alcohol, like one glass of wine or a beer, something like that, that's also been shown to increase the likelihood of having sudden insights. We're saying just a little bit of alcohol, because if you have too much, obviously you can't do anything. You won't be able to figure anything out. But just a little, yeah. So just a little bit of alcohol will have a similar effect to trying to solve problems at your off-peak time of day. It makes you a little bit fuzzy, less focused, less rigid and structured in thinking. So those are just a few of the ways that we can coax the mind to have these aha moments, these insights. And again, there's no way to sort of like hack where you just press a button and have an idea. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Now, we may come to that point. We're in the beginnings of a lot of research on brain stimulation techniques, where we could put a couple of electrodes on the head and put a very, very weak electrical current through. It's been shown that if you put the electrodes in the right place, for certain types of puzzles, it can increase the number of solutions that are aha moments. But, I don't know that this will ever become a real practical technology, because we don't know yet that there is, you would have to know something about the type of problem in order to know where to put the electrodes on the head in advance. And that may or may not be practical. Okay. So None of that technology is ready to be used, and we don't know anything yet about medications, drugs that might be helpful. I mean, there's a lot of talk about psychedelic drugs, and so far, and again, this research is in a very, very early stage. So far, when people take psychedelic drugs, they feel like they're having some profound insight, but that feeling of insight doesn't seem to correspond to whether it really is a profound insight. These drugs may just give people the feeling that they're being creative and insightful without necessarily making them. So again, there is no, we don't know of any particular type of drug that will help people to have these eureka moments, except that a little bit of alcohol will do that. For some people, we don't know if it works for everybody, but I think just sort of common sense, if you just loosen up and relax and are in a positive mood, which a little bit of alcohol can do, then that can help.
I like how all the things that you just described are real, actual tips that, a lot of listeners of this podcast are startup founders, and they can actually use it. They can hire, like they can rent the space that you described, like with the high ceilings. They can schedule the daily, meetings in a way that so I really liked everything is super helpful and productive. I do want to ask another question. We talked about it a little bit before this interview. So you discussed about anxiety and how it narrows the focus of the brain on a human level. Periods of crisis or sometimes existential threats, obviously they're not supposed to elicit any creative moments, because of course evolutionary wise we need to focus on the problem and the threat. But on the other level, there are like kind of other side effects that I personally feel, and maybe others, that when you're in this kind of harsh periods, you kind of want to go to artistic creations or things like that, or maybe you want to you really truly engage in more activities that are deepening, I guess this is the word, or on very deep level of meaning. And can that be another path or another route that can take you to a breakthrough or insight, because you kind of think more deeply about things and less superficial?
That's a really interesting question. And actually, again, it's like 2 or 3 questions in there. So let me try to unpack that. So we know that stress, as I said, it sort of narrows the scope of thought. Research shows that in general, stress will make thinking more rigid and less flexible, so that it's you might be more likely to be stuck on one particular idea that isn't working, and less likely to be able to shift to some other idea. Now, there are some people, rare individuals, who are not affected by stress in that way. So there are some people that rare individuals who, when they're in a moment of crisis, they can think very creatively and flexibly to find ways to get out of that. We don't know what makes those people tick, but because these are rare individuals, and it's hard to study. You can't, find them and then put them in a laboratory situation and create a crisis. And then, I mean, it's very complicated research to do. But those are the kind of people that we want to have as leaders. People who, whether they're leaders in government or business or the military or anything, people who a crisis situation will bring out the best in them in terms of their creative thinking to solve problems that inevitably arise when people are in crises. Now, one possibility is that those kind of people just don't feel anxiety and stress in the way that most people do. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that when certain people, when they're in a crisis situation, it's not that they aren't necessarily as anxious as other people in general, but they might have a higher degree of sort of acceptance or mindfulness. It's sort of like, they're not worried about all the things that can go bad, because they accept, okay, that's just the way it is. And that itself reduces anxiety and stress. And then their minds can open up to new ideas. Now, does thinking about sort of the bigger issues of life, whether these are theological or philosophical or whatever, does that increase creativity? And there's very, very little relevant research, but the research that's out there suggests that often people have ideas, insights, eureka moments when they start looking at a problem, not in terms of the specifics of that problem, but in a more general way. They think, okay, this problem I'm having in getting my toddler to eat vegetables, this is just one example of this larger problem of getting people to do things that they don't want to do, but it's in their interest to do. So what do I do in this larger sense? How do I deal with this larger problem? Thinking about things more abstractly can help one to solve very specific concrete problems. And thinking about things abstractly in one domain could generalize to other domains. So if you start thinking, if you read Plato, for example, and it has you thinking about the really big issues of existence and meaning and all of that, that might put you in this abstract frame of mind that makes concrete problems easier to solve. Now, there's a little research that suggests this. I'm being more speculative, but let's put it this way. It couldn't hurt, right? It's not going to impair your thinking to think about, it's not going to impair your ability to solve problems of life by thinking about the larger issues of life. It's certainly not going to hurt. It may help. There's some reason to think it may help. And often, if you think about the larger issues, that can help to reduce anxiety too. So
I was just going to say that.
Yeah. So one example is, people may think, um, is my job secure? How am I going to pay my mortgage bill this month? Things are tight right now, and my coworkers are being kind of mean lately, and this and that. And so you're thinking about a very specific thing. But then if you zoom out to the larger picture, I have a job. I'm not going to go hungry. Maybe money's a little tight, but I can pay my bills, and my coworkers are not so bad. And think about all the people who don't have a job, don't have any money. They don't know where their next meal is going to come from, and their coworkers are trying to kill them and all of that. So if you think in the big picture, sometimes it diminishes the problem, the concrete problems you're dealing with. And then, the solution, it puts you in a better mood to think about, to be grateful for the things you have, to think about to put in perspective the little problems that you're dealing with that, they seem big to us individually, but in the grand scheme of things, they may not be that important because they will pass. So yes, I think, there is good reason. There's not a lot of science to back this up, but I think it makes a lot of sense that zooming out, thinking about the big picture can help one to come up with solutions and ideas that can enhance life.
I can totally see it. Everything you wrote. I actually do read Plato before I go to sleep, and it makes me feel better. So, okay. So this podcast is all about how it is very human to be creative, or creativity is a human trait, and we're trying to, of course, learn more about it. So if we talk a little bit about AI, you mentioned earlier the object fixation problem, and that, kind of solve itself when you go to sleep. But AI, when we talk to generative AI, and many people are studying it right now, can AI support creativity, but also could create kind of fixation by giving us very fast answers? We don't need to think anymore. So is there any study suggesting that talking to generative AI is a little bit like similar to object fixation? Does it help you be creative or become more creative?
Okay. All right. So the relationship between AI and human creativity, it's become a big area of research, and it's actually kind of a complicated area of research. So one thing to keep in mind is that these AI large language models are evolving, changing, and improving, month by month. So anything that, you could, any answer to your question that relies on what these models can do at this moment may not be applicable a month or two from now. Okay, so let's just keep that in mind. Now, um, in terms of creativity, there are good ways and bad ways to use AI, or good effects and bad effects potentially of AI. The bad way would be to just outsource one's creativity to the AI. And this is a big problem in education right now, in higher education, because often professors assign students to write papers and essays, and the students will just have the AI chatbot write the essay. And it's kind of obvious to the professors. With just a little bit of experience, professors are very good at distinguishing between AI-generated work and student-generated work. The AI-generated writing, it tends to be kind of formulaic, and it's not terrible, but it's not very good. Now, if a student is always outsourcing their creativity, and they're doing this from a fairly young age, that does not bode well for their own brain development. There hasn't been a whole lot of research yet on what those effects are, but I don't think it's hard to predict what the effects are. Anything that you don't do a lot, you're not going to become good at. And if you're constantly running to the chatbot for ideas, that will not enable a person to develop their own creative idea generations. That is, that's bad. Now, can the AI be a helpful creative partner? Yes, absolutely. So I mentioned that for many people, things in the environment can trigger ideas. Similarly, AIs can produce things that will trigger ideas. So if you're working on writing an essay or solving a problem, and you can ask questions of the AI or ask the AI to interview you about the problem, and the AI can produce prompts or possibilities like, maybe there's some way to use that idea to solve a problem, and then you can go ahead and do it. So just like a person working with other people in a team can help to improve problem solving and idea generation, that AI could become the team for you, and you go back and forth with it. It can trigger ideas, offer information that you hadn't thought of, perhaps even shake you out of fixation on a particular idea. But just like there are bad creative teams and good creative teams, or bad uses of teams and good uses of creative teams, again, as long as you're not using the AI as a crutch, or as a just sort of outsourcing the problem to the AI, then the AI can be very useful. Now, what studies of the creativity of the AIs shows that, they're actually, for some domains, they're pretty good. I mean, they can write a passable essay, or, even passable poetry or something like that, or solve certain problems. But the solutions are not, they're moderately creative, but they're not very creative, because keep in mind that the way these large language models work is they're trained on all the knowledge humans have generated that are put on the web. And and this is a great exaggeration, but I'll use the term anyway. They're sort of like souped up autocomplete. They predict based on one word, what's the next likely word, what's the next likely word, etc., starting with the prompt that you give it. It's giving you good information, but it's sort of generic. It's not going to give you a lot of really surprising. I mean, creative ideas, creative products are often surprising. If they weren't surprising, then everyone would be thinking of them. It's like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. It's a surprise. But the AIs, they might surprise you with good their products can be, but they don't often surprise in terms of the creativity of those products. So a person should not want to have their creativity limited by the modest creativity of the chatbots. And that's why it's best to use them as triggers for your own creativity, and so that you can develop your own creativity rather than depending on them. I don't know if that answered
Yeah,
your
it does.
question. Yeah.
Actually, if we think about, philosophically, and you just mentioned that, AI is going to improve itself all the time. Maybe the architecture will be completely different in the sense that AI will become all of a sudden very creative and very human creative. Is there another reason to insist that we keep creativity our own trait, like kind of like human creativity? Are there reasons that you see that even if AI will become more creative than us, we should keep still the human creativity?
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple of reasons. One is that humans evolved, we survived because we're able to solve problems, to think of new ways to enhance our survival and to thrive and all that. The human brain evolve, or the human brain from childhood, from birth on, develops according to a certain, shall I say, plan. In other words, when you're born, there's a lot that's pre-wired due to your genetics, due to your DNA. But the human brain requires experiences, new information in order to continue to wire itself up and to develop in ways that are healthy and normal. And in fact, the human brain doesn't really even complete being its process of wiring up until a person is in his or her early stages. So this brain development goes on for a long time. It doesn't stop. So, I tell my 20-year-old college students, I said, your brain's going to go keep on wiring itself up for the next dozen years. So you're not as good now as you will be in the future. Keep that in mind. And if you don't keep challenging your brain, you will never reach that full potential. Like a muscle, you have to use that muscle or it will never develop. And I think that there's a real danger that if we rely too much on these chatbots, let children use them and even young adults too much, their brains will simply not reach the level of development that they could, and we'll have a generation of people whose minds are not fully formed and are not able to deal with the problems of life, the problems of the world. And does anyone want to depend on an artificial intelligence for dealing with every aspect of one's life? So you may use chatbots to, learn mathematics and history and to write essays and things like that. But are you going to use that chatbot to solve your interpersonal problems of dealing with a difficult sibling or parent or spouse? Or no, I mean, you have to be able to think in the moment to solve problems in the moment. And you don't want to have, who wants to have a chatbot whispering in their ears all the time, do this, now do that, now do this, now do that, and you become a vegetable.
Even in the business world, if you think about it, a very concrete world, if like salespeople, they need to improvise constantly. So not even on, on a philosophical level, even in a practical level of working and selling and bringing income to your company, you can't just rely on something that can't help you improvise.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're in a business meeting and someone asks you a question, you can't say, "Oh, wait a minute, let me ask my chatbot and I'll give you an answer." You can't do that. You'll look like an idiot and you'll get fired. So yeah, it's absolutely the case. But also, you need your own intelligence and your own creativity in order to evaluate the responses of a chatbot. So, for example, these large language models are getting pretty good at writing computer code, but that's not going to eliminate the need for computer programmers, because you need computer programmers to evaluate the code, to test the code, to understand it, to debug it, to all of those things. Then we may not need as many computer coders with chatbots, but we'll still need some. Similarly, the AIs are getting better and better at reading MRIs and X-rays. Does that mean that we are going to eliminate all radiologists? No. We may need fewer of them, but we still need good radiologists to check and verify what the AIs are saying, to interpret that and to explain it to a patient, and put it in a bigger context and all of that. So this is something that civilization is going to have to work out over the years, and we'll have to keep reinventing because these AIs are going to change and our civilization is going to change as a result. But we have to work out what is the ideal productive relationship between human intelligence and artificial intelligence, and how do we protect humanity and human intelligence and human creativity so that it does not get subsumed into AI. So that's going to be one of the big problems of the age if we survive to the point where it gets becomes critical.
And just for the last question, I always ask the interviewees something personal about a moment or something they recall that a creative moment or aha moment or just their creativity saved them from like a situation or helped them when they most needed it.
That's a tough one. When I decided to change my research areas from memory to creativity and insight, I mean, that was an actual aha moment where I can even remember where I was sitting at the moment and where this idea just popped into my head for this change of essentially sort of a career change in a way. And that was a very, very specific aha moment. I mean, I've had lots of other aha moments, and probably that might be, in terms of aha moments, that's probably one of the major ones. It's not one that sort of like saved me from some disaster or something like that, but it did set me on a different course. And yeah, I guess that would be my answer to that. And I mean, everybody has their own aha moments. I should say one interesting thing about this too is that I remember many years ago reading a paper written by a computer scientist who wanted to know about the thought processes of Nobel Prize winners. And she interviewed many, many Nobel Prize winners in many areas. And she asked each of them, was there like a particular aha moment that set them on this course towards eventually winning a Nobel Prize and making their discoveries? Most of them said no. Most of them said, no, there was no one aha moment. It was just working, very incrementally and hard over many years and just making incremental advances. And I thought that was kind of strange because there are a lot of stories in science and art of aha moments. But then I realized a few years later, I read an article in I think it was the alumni magazine of the University of Michigan, about some scientist who had won some prize. And the journalist who interviewed him asked the same question. Was there a particular aha moment that set you on this course? And he gave the usual response. No. I was working incrementally over many years and gradually came to. And then later in the interview, he was talking about, like a couple of pages later, 2-3 pages later, he was saying, one day I was taking the shower and this idea popped into my head. And I knew that this was the solution. I ran to the laboratory and blah, blah, et cetera, et cetera. And it occurred to me that people sometimes have these aha moments, but they don't stand out in their memories as being life-changing things. That often these single moments can become swamped or subsumed by a whole lifetime of work and experiences and things like that. So sometimes, you ask people about their aha moments and they say, I can't think of any. But if you keep pressing them and then you draw them out, they often have had these moments, but they don't label it as a eureka moment or something like that. And then you have to talk to them and explain, well, isn't that what I'm talking about? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I guess that's sort of it.
Makes sense. I think especially these scientists, they just don't recognize this as something that they should, focus on. But they're having these moments all the time. They just like when they interpret it, they don't recognize it as an important moment of their career. Or
Yes. Well, in fact, there's a famous geneticist, Barbara McClintock, who won a Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine for her work in genetics. And she wrote about having these eureka moments. Like there was one instance where she was trying to solve some problem, and she was working hard on it, and a genetics problem. And the solution popped into her mind as a eureka moment. And she knew it was correct, but she couldn't figure out why it was correct. She couldn't figure out how her mind had, what were the unconscious steps her mind had to go through to get to that solution. And then, so she spent a lot of time thinking about where does that idea come from? What were the steps that are outside of my awareness to get to that? Because she knew, and this is true in science and in many other areas, is that if you have an idea that just comes out of the blue, often people won't take it seriously unless you can explain how they came up with the idea. So scientists often write grant proposals to get funding for their research from government agencies or foundations. If any scientist writes a grant proposal where they said, I just had this idea in the shower and give me the money to do this research, they would just be laughed off. So you have the idea. So what you have to do is then go back and create not a story, but a rationale for where this idea emerges, what's its grounding in previous research. You have to create a whole context for it before a funding agency will take it seriously. Because no matter how interesting, how good, how creative, how powerful the idea is, if you can't give it some context, often people will just think that it's just a random, meaningless thought.
Yeah. Especially, I read a book about this astrophysicist, and she wanted to explore the origins of the universe and the multi-universe. And she specifically didn't want to study something that was very obvious, the theoretical astrophysicist. And she definitely she describes, I will send later, she describes an aha moment, definitely sitting in a cafe bar, everything, everything by the book,
Mm-hmm.
And then she started actually working on it because she had to prove everything. And then she had to, and she just constantly was trying to say exactly as you described. She was trying to make sense of it in a way. And she couldn't just talk about having an aha moment. So I can definitely see it. And really, thank you so much, Professor John Kounios.
My pleasure.
For being here and having the time to speak with us. Thank you so much.